In fact, protein should be the basis of meals and nutrition because it is the shelter that will ultimately nourish the tissues of the body, whether it is the skin, hair, nails, and obviously the muscles. And actually, this is the part that is the least mastered and often the most underestimated in the diet of average people, especially among individuals who are rather sedentary, either due to the fact that the protein intake will come from low-quality foods, or due to the fact that it is simply underconsumed, because the majority of people sometimes tend to be afraid of protein-rich foods, or simply due to the fact that it is what will cost the most. So how do we estimate their ideal protein intake? If we look at the official nutritional recommendations, ANSES in France recommends between 0.83 and 2, or even 2.2 g per kilogram of body weight per day, which would give for a person who weighs about 70 kilograms between 60 and 150 g of protein per day approximately. Except that the lower range dates back to recommendations that are inherited from the 1950s that come from the United States, and it has evolved very little over the course of the 20th century. This small fork is increasingly seen as a crucial minimum today, but not truly like an optimal choice. More scientists, nutritionists believe it's time to increase minimum intake, set it at 1 or 1.2 g per kilogram body weight/day, instead of 0.8. It will depend on a multitude of factors. Thank you very much. Among others, the current muscle mass, the desired muscle mass, age, gender, etc. But to simplify as much as possible, to schematize, if we want to define our protein intake as accurately as possible, the one that suits us best, we can methodologically start from a rather low range, therefore 1.2 g per kilogram of body weight to begin with, for someone who is fairly sedentary, and gradually increase it to 1.6 g per kilogram of body weight per day for someone who is more active or older. As we age, our protein metabolism improves, and we require a greater amount to maintain the health of our tissues and muscles. We'll target high-end range for athletic individuals, especially those who do bodybuilding. Regarding the specific case of low-carb or ketogenic diet practitioners, protein intake is generally estimated at around 20% of the total caloric intake, provided that there is a caloric intake. "20% is now irrelevant." In the Mediterranean diet, which is considered the simplest and healthiest eating pattern because it combines elements of low-carb, paleo, flexitarian diets, etc. And besides, it's going to be a diet, low insulinemic and low inflammatory. 20% of the total caloric intake should come from proteins. The initial trap is to confuse the protein and the food that contains protein. When we say we should give, for example, 1.4 g protein per kilogram body weight, for a 70 kilograms person, it represents about 100 g protein. So protein is macronutrient, but it doesn't represent 100 g of meat. In 100 g of meat, we will have 20 to 23 g of proteins. The remaining components will consist of lipids, fats, water, and other nutrients. It's important to know 100 g of meat is not 100 g of proteins. The second trap is when we say protein intake should be about 20% of total caloric intake. It's not about 20% of plate volume or visually, but 20% of energy intake in calories. That's why it's extremely important to learn how to calculate these calories, not to be a calorie psycho-rigid, but only to know what the portion of proteins can represent on a plate and more generally in a diet. For example, it corresponds to 4 kilocalories, and 1 g of lipids, for example 1 g of butter, corresponds to 9 kilocalories. Lipids more energy dense, thus 9 kilocalories versus 4 for proteins, change everything when discussing 20% of proteins in caloric intake. For instance, a Mediterranean diet plate, like those in low-carb or blue zones, may include an avocado, salmon, bulgur, veggies, and olive oil. This plate could have approximately 1,000 calories. We'd have about 35 g of carbs, mainly from bulgur, for example, from starchy foods and 37 g of protein from salmon. These 37 g represent about 150 kilocalories of protein, which is about 15–20% of the plate's portion. On the other hand, lipids in this plate represent more, about 600 kilocalories. It's important to know this to understand that in a keto diet, when we say we need 80% lipids, we won't put 80% olive oil on the plate in terms of volume. We'll put 80% in terms of calories. Furthermore, this example demonstrates that the Mediterranean diet isn't solely or exclusively vegetarian, but rather a flexitarian diet that includes animal proteins along with plant-based options for vegetarians. Because it is the protein that will ultimately be the essential macronutrient, along with lipids, obviously. Plants will complement the protein intake in a med-style plate, and plants will bring other things: vitamins, numbers, satiety, culinary pleasure, colors, etc. Therefore, it is crucial to understand this. Place protein as the focal point of your meal to ensure you do not overlook the benefits of energy, vitality, libido, and to prevent any deficiencies that may impact the skin, hair, and muscle mass. Protein intake when 1.5 g per kilogram of body weight should not be fixed by weight. It does not necessarily have to be based on an individual's current weight, but on the target weight, ideally going through successive layers in a range of 5 kilograms. And that's the objective we're striving for, increasing muscle mass or reducing fat mass. Therefore, if our goal is to gain muscle mass, we should target the higher end of the range, which is 1.4 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. Additionally, we should engage in a resistance sport to promote muscle development. And moreover, we will simultaneously increase its intake of carbohydrates and lipids in order to be in a caloric surplus. On the contrary, for people trying to lose weight, one technique that is little known and few understand is that while it's often necessary to lower total calorie intake, provided they don't have a collapsed metabolism to begin with, it's especially important not to decrease protein intake. Aim for high range of 1.5 to 2 g per kilogram of body weight while reducing carbohydrate and fat intake a little. Whether you are trying to gain weight or trying to lose weight, the intake of proteins will remain more or less constant. That's why it is a bit insidious to calculate your protein intake based on total calories. And that's why it is good to start with the important part when maintaining a high protein intake and gradually reducing your intake of carbohydrates and/or fats according to the chosen dietary mode. The most important thing is to do it over a relatively short period of 2 weeks to a month and a half, so that our body does not eventually adapt to this calorie deficit and we reach a plateau where we are forced to dig deeper and deeper into our calorie deficit. And that's when it becomes a vicious circle because we were advised too much. If you're interested in proteins and want to take control of your diet, visit the Blueness Guide on blueness.com. They have a section dedicated to proteins, so it's no longer a secret for you.